Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Nick White. I am a consultant clinical psychologist working for Brighton and Hove CAMHS, which is part of the Sussex Partnership. I'm really grateful that so many of you managed to join us this evening after what I imagine would have been a typically busy day for you all. What we're going to do this evening is spend a bit of time together thinking about how we might support children and young people with anxiety as parents and carers. What we'd be really keen to do is to try and involve you in some aspects of our time today. Unfortunately, anxiety is a very wide-reaching subject, and I think I'm really mindful that we might, with the apologies, not have a chance to cover all the areas of the topic that you might be interested in today, but we'll certainly try and do our best. So what we'll look to do is we're going to have some time to think through some strategies and some ideas around working with anxiety. We'll then take a short break, about 5 minutes or so, and where possible, answer some of the sort of questions that have come in prior to the workshop today. With apologies, depending on time, we may not have a chance to answer live questions, but we'll do our best. I think one of the things I wanted to mention, and I say this both as a clinician, but also the parent of a young person with anxiety, is that I think it can be very challenging sometimes when you see the term parent workshop or parenting workshop, because I think it can sometimes feel like it's a suggestion that we as parents are not doing what we're meant to be doing. I think, to be very clear, this is not a workshop that we're putting together because it's a sense that you're not doing the right thing. Intuitively, you will have a lot of skills and strengths as parents that you bring along with you, and that you're using in supporting your children and young people as carers. But I think it's about recognizing the additional challenges that can come along with being concerned about a child or young person who has significant anxiety. So today is certainly not about saying that you're doing things wrong, or to suggest that there's a difficulty in your parenting that's brought you along here today. But my sense is that what's come along brought you along is perhaps a curiosity about things that might be helpful, and hopefully what we can do in the next sort of 90 minutes or so is try and touch on some of the things that you might find practically useful in your experience as parents and carers. So these are about starting points and some ideas that you might then be able to build on. There'll be some references and some resources at the end of the presentation that you might find useful, and of course these will be sent out after the presentation as well. So I hope that what we talk about today will touch on some of those important areas for you. So as we think a little bit further, one of the things that I think would be good to start off with, just give us a bit of context, a bit of thinking about our time together today. So let's just move on. One of the interesting things that young people ask is about, well, actually, what is anxiety? What does it mean to me? What does it mean to our children? What does it mean for us as carers? And I think the answer is that it's something that is widely spoken about. It actually infiltrates a lot of different areas of our culture and the language that we use. I think this is really well illustrated by something that happened a few years ago, where the Oxford University Press launched or each year put out a children's word of the year. So this is a panel of young people, and what happens is that they're asked to take from a short list a word that they feel best identifies their experiences as young people. So just I suppose in thinking about that, it might not surprise you to know that the word of the year in 2017 was Trump. The word of the year in 2018 was plastic. The word of the year in 2019 was Brexit. The word of the year in 2020 was coronavirus. But perhaps significantly for us, the word of the year in 2021 was anxiety. So I think, although it's something that can cause huge difficulties, and I think it can be very difficult to discuss, nonetheless, our children and young people are very aware of its impact on their lives to the extent it's very pervasive. So again, what we'll do today is start to have a think about some of the things that might be helpful to hold in mind when we're approaching this as parents and carers. I'm going to just for a moment stop the presentation there, and we're going to ask you to take part in our first poll. It's just to get a bit of a sense of who's in the audience today. So what will happen is you'll get a notification to give us a bit of a sense about which age group your children and young people fall into, and that will just help us think a little bit about perhaps how we might include some information for particular age groups today. So Vicky, I know that you can share the screen, and we should have a live version of the poll being completed. So again, if you had felt able to start and complete the poll, it will have the number at the top of the screen there again if you hadn't yet signed up. But what it should help us to do is just get a bit of a sense about who is with us this evening. I find the changes in these polls quite hypnotic, actually, I have to say. So it's really exciting to see how these things move around. It's been like a race. But nonetheless, it looks like we've got quite a wide age range, actually. So it looks like there are some carers with us who've got much younger children. It looks like also we've got sort of a bulk coming from that middle childhood, sort of 5 to 10 years, and then 10 to 15 years, and then quite a few parents and carers who are coming along with 15 plus. So obviously those are very wide categories, but actually, if we think about it in a bit more detail, what strikes us when we're thinking about this topic is that there are quite a lot of variations in age in terms of how anxiety can affect our young people. And it can depend on a number of different things, including past experiences, the sort of current situation. But I think hopefully, judging by the age range that has come across in our poll there should be something for everyone in our discussion today. Okay, so I'm going to reshare my screen, Ziggy, if that's okay. Thank you so much for everyone that had participated in that. And we'll revisit that again in just a moment. So what are we going to think about today? So the aim of our workshop this evening is to think a little bit more about what is anxiety, to think about some of the specific issues for children and young people that we might need to hold in mind, but also how can we help as parents and carers? What are some of the things that we might bring along with us in terms of skills? What are some of the things that we can introduce that might help when we're concerned about how our young people are coping and managing? I'm going to go back to a poll again just in a moment. And I'd just like to ask if as an audience, you can think about what might be the things that we'd feel anxious about as adults. So these might be from your own experiences. They might be from speaking with other people in your family, friends. It might just be your general sense about what might be the sorts of things that could be topics of anxiety as adults. So again, I'll stop the screen share for the moment, and through the magic of polling, I know, Ziggy, you're going to screen share again for us. So you should get a notification, those that had signed up, and it will ask you for a single word that perhaps you feel captures what seems to be the sort of main things you think adults would tend to worry about. Okay. Thanks, Ziggy. Okay, so right the way from the beginning there, we've got relationships, family, work, finances, and thinking that the larger the word, the more likely it is that multiple people have responded to that. So money being dead center there, children, socializing, health. See the word balance there as well. Bills, the environment. Okay. So again, friendships in there as well. And sometimes I think we forget and relationships as we become adults that those are equally important for us. Housing, bills, noise there as well. So again, thinking about that wide spectrum of what can trigger anxiety for us. Just a few more moments. Thank you so much to all those people that are sending responses. Confidence. Again, jobs up a couple of times there as well. Dynamics. Again, so just taking a snapshot for those that can see it, money is dead center. Children, health, family, the largest. But I think it's really important to embrace that sort of wider range there as well. So we're gonna stop that particular poll just for a moment, and we'll come back to that and just after a bit moment of reflection. So when we saw that word, well, I don't know what people's reactions were. Many of you might have thought, oh gosh, actually that's really close to my experiences. Those are some of the things that tend to be conversations in our household. They may even be things you find yourself having conversations with your children and young people, those that you care for. Just going to take a moment and just have a bit of a chance to prompt some reflection about then how our children might experience anxiety. And to do that, I'm going to introduce this. So for those who don't recognise it, this is Burke. And the spider is called Drut, and the skull is called Boney. And I put them up because they were from a children's television program called Trapdoor. Now, I've been around a little bit, so it is very possible that I might be the oldest person in the room, and other people may not remember Trapdoor, but it was a television program that I used to love as a child when I was growing up in sort of the late 80s and 90s, which tells you probably all you need to know about how old I am. It had the most amazing theme tune, and I remember it used to be on ITV. And for me, it was one of the things that I used to never miss. It was really funny. And I think it's one of the things that instantly makes me think back to being a child again. I think one of the most important things we have on our side when we're supporting our children and young people is the knowledge that we have all been children. We have all probably had, lots of different experiences when we're children, but nonetheless, we've all been children. And sometimes connecting with outside of us can be an important first step in thinking about how we support anxiety. So I'm just going to take a minute. I'm going to ask you as the audience just to have a think for me. What was your favorite television program when you were about 9 or 10 years of age? Was it a cartoon? Was it some kind of drama? Was it something that there was a box set of and you used to binge on when you got home from school? Was it something that you'd got shown by a brother or a sister or another member of the family and suddenly got into? So just imagine for me a moment being at that age, television program that you absolutely loved, that you couldn't miss, and that when you think about it, maybe takes you back to that stage of your life. I'm willing to bet the theme tune isn't as good as Trapdoor, but there's some great theme tunes out there. Okay, so if you all got that television program in your head, brilliant. So we're going to do another quick poll now. And this time, I'm going to ask you to think about, so what might make you feel anxious? What might you feel anxious about as children? So again, you can draw from your own memories of that time, only if you're comfortable to, but particularly this might be general conversations you've had with your children, or it might be conversations you've had as a family. So I'm going to stop screen share again, and we're going back to the poll. And this time, the question will be, what do children worry about? So I can see there's been some responses already. And there's likely to be some overlapping themes, isn't there? But then we see school, dead center, rowing, friendships, interview, parents arguing. I can see someone there has mentioned more sort of physical fears. Someone's mentioned about being sick there. I have to say I'm really impressed whoever managed to get an emoji into the poll. We've not seen that yet today, Ziggy, have we? So that I have to say bonus marks for that person. That looks to be a school to me. So again, school quite front and center. Weight, sexuality has come up a couple of times there. So teachers, popularity. I can see dogs there as well. So animals. Family members as well. So seeing there that some people have put down when families change, so divorce. Okay. Just a few more moments, but you can see it's interesting, isn't it, that there's although there were a huge number of answers for our what do you feel anxious about as adults, actually there's a huge range, isn't there, of different things. And what's the theme here is we've got school in the center, friendships being critically important for a lot of our children and young people, transition and change, confidence, but noticing there a lot about change in body, so puberty, health, and all the confusion and uncertainty that can bring along with it. So that's such a rich response. Thank you so much to those who contributed and to the feedback there. Okay, so as we can see, there's an awful lot of crossover between the types of worries we might have as adults, but the worries of children, but there's also some real specifics there, isn't there? Some of the things that are very much located in that period of our lives where there are lots of different pressures and demands on us. And I think one of the things we'll come back to later is a bit of a recognition that our current situation, sort of post-COVID, all the things that are going on, it can feel like the kind of asks that are being made of our children and young people have again evolved. If we think about particularly the pressures that we have had as families during COVID, that as parents and carers we were being asked alongside brilliant school staff, but nonetheless asked to be taking on a role as teacher, students being asked to teach themselves often more intensely at times as well. So we'll revisit that, but it's a bit like where roles have changed, where responsibilities have changed. It's very much sort of the forefront of our minds at the moment. So what is anxiety? We've got some ideas there about what can be causes of anxiety, but just if we're thinking at a very basic level, a very fundamental level, everyone, children and adults alike, experience worries, fears, and anxieties. And this typically involves a combination of anxious thoughts, so the focus on potential threats, something bad is going to happen, I don't know what to do, this is going to go wrong. That anxious behavior, So thinking a lot about the kind of reactions that we might have, the fight, the flight, the safety seeking, you know, those kind of behaviors that we engage in when our anxiety level is high and we feel heightened and not sure what to do. And then an anxious body. So it could include breathing rapidly, becoming sweaty, butterflies in the tummy. I think one of the most important things that our sort of little poll exercise showed as well is that such as the variety of different causes for anxiety, also the way in which our children and young people express anxiety is going to be very particular to them. Again, there'll be some consistencies with their friends and peers, but actually it's a very individual experience. I think trying to understand that is an excellent starting point from when we're trying to help where anxiety gets in the way. I think the other thing to think about as well is how these things can mutually influence each other. So again, when we have an anxious set of thoughts and feelings, it's that impact on our physical reactions. But then when our body reacts, our thoughts will react as well. One of the things that's very important to keep in mind is that a lot of our anxiety reactions are many years old. We're going back right to early history of human beings. We've always hardwired to react to threat. But what happens is that over centuries and many millennia, our hardwired system has got kind of out of keeping with our current experiences. So that fight or flight, people may have heard of before, that sense to which we react really strongly to perceived threat, ready to run away, ready to fight against it, or even actually ready to seek safety, or at times to freeze, not being sure what to do, is something really strongly connected to kind of ancient systems. So one of the things we sometimes need to do, and we learn to develop as we grow older, is to kind of help that ancient system work for us rather than against us. But when we're a child or young person, we haven't had those experiences. You know, we're not in the position to be able to make sense of it without help sometimes. So just from a broader point of view, there's been quite a few sort of research studies over recent times thinking about how common anxiety disorders are for children and young people. And it's estimated about 6.5% of children have a formal anxiety disorder. Now, it's quite an interesting idea when we think about what is an anxiety disorder. And I think it's really importantly, we keep in mind that although there are diagnostic labels that people might use, and these might be the sorts of things that we've picked up in research studies around how common an experience is, when we're there on the ground working with children and young people, we tend to be aware that young people don't fit in one box, that their anxiety is likely to have a number of different layers to it. So my suspicion is, as you might have found yourself as parents and carers, that the number of young people for whom anxiety is interfering is a much greater number than that. I think it's really important, and I know that I noticed someone in the QA had asked earlier, and we'll come back to it, is that is it difficult that we might over focus on anxiety? And I think it is a really important balance. So anxiety is a naturally occurring state, and we can't remove all of this from our children's lives. However, what we can help them to do is to manage the feelings as much as possible so they don't interfere with the ability to thrive and enjoy their lives. And again, hopefully we'll come back to some strategies later on that might be helpful. Noticing our poll earlier for the ages of children that we're caring for, I think it is helpful just to keep in mind some of the differences there might be there in terms of how anxiety can present and come across. So in younger children, it might be more likely that we see extreme shyness, sort of timidity, clinging, sort of not wanting to let go, that experience that many people might have of being at the school gate and having, our son, our daughter sort of clinging to our leg, hiding behind us, I think is something that's very common. Those worries about separation, the difficulties mixing with other children can be a sign of anxiety as well. The difficulty getting off to and staying asleep. Frequent nightmares can be very common. I think we're also being aware at night time. If you imagine the phase our younger children are at when they're just learning, how their body works and how, getting into that rhythm of life, you could see frequent sort of nighttime wetting as well. Could be a sign of anxiety. Repeated complaints of headache or tummy ache, that feeling that you get when someone you care for is like, oh, really bad tummy, and I don't think I can do this. My tummy feels bad. Often it's those physical signs that will come out more for our younger children. And then constantly asking if things are all right, or whether there are ways they can be reassured. Is this going to be okay? Can I do this? Is it going to be all right? Can you help me? So again, increases in those areas. I think it's really important to say as well that these types of behaviours can also occur for lots of young people, not necessarily because there's a significant presence of anxiety, but I think it's where these things occur in combination, where they occur to a degree that starts to really interfere with that young person's life and that child's life, that we have to be thinking about. So what might that step need to be? For those, and thinking earlier that in our poll, we also had quite a few parents and carers who are at that older end of the spectrum in terms of 10 plus, some going into sort of 16, 17, 18 years of age as well. So we might see things like increased withdrawal, reduced mood, disrupted sleep, increased eating, reduced appetite, increased irritability, and we may even see things like increased activity involving drugs or alcohol, or indeed even self-harm. Now, unfortunately, in our time today, we won't have a chance to address all of those issues. I'm very conscious that there is another presentation that's looking particularly at self-harm. So I would encourage you, if it's something that's affected a young person you care for or affected you, is to look at the recordings of that workshop, which I think will give a bit more detail in those areas. The other thing just to consider as well, we were saying actually the real dilemma for us as parents is, well, how do we figure out what part of the reaction that I'm seeing is, for want of better words, normal or common, because the part of the development that my child or young person's going through. And in this instance, for example, it's very common to have increased irritability when you're a teenager, for example. And, indeed, you may have had conversations where people might say, oh, that'll be fine, it's just a phase. And it could very well be just a phase. But I think, again, the sort of things we're thinking about is where there's a combination of what we put here. This is not an exhaustive list, so a combination of different challenges, but also the length of time and the level to which it interferes for that young person. What impact does it have? One of the standing jokes in the office is that I have a bit of a fascination for biscuits, and will often not pass opportunity to fit them into a meeting. If anyone likes to know, I'm a custard cream fan, but although I could be pushed with chocolate bourbon if necessary, not a big fan of hobnobs for some reason. Joking aside, though, the reason I put a biscuit box up is just to sort of make, I think, a wider point about the nature of anxiety. So obviously, there are many different selections in this wonderful selection pack we've got in front of us. Now, ultimately, though, they are still biscuits. They still have certain themes, certain components that make them biscuits. And similarly with anxiety, there are many different types of anxiety, many different causes, but the underlying themes, and therefore the underlying way in which we might try and help, will have some common themes. There's still that core way in which anxiety can affect us. I'm just going to mention, though, however, some of the sort of different ways in which young people might talk about anxiety, but might experience anxiety. And I think particularly if we were working with a young person or a family came to see us, these are some of the things we'd be beginning to explore. And your knowledge and experience of parents and carers of this is absolutely invaluable. So I think in the first instance, fears and phobias is interesting, isn't it? How often language tends to crop up in all sorts of different situations. That, oh, I've got a bit of a phobia of that, or I can't stand that. I feel like I'm a bit of a dog phobic, or I find it hard to cope with certain situations. So actually, if we listen to the kind of discussions we might have, these kind of languages are really common. However, with the kind of phobia that's interfering, it's often a fear of a particular place, situation, or object. And the fear, the danger that we experience is likely to be a healthy and quite natural response to certain situations, but it's when it becomes excessive and interfering that support may be needed. So sort of common fears, and thinking back to our word cloud earlier, could be things like injections, being sick. I noticed that someone had put being sick or vomiting in the word cloud earlier. Fear of the dark. So these are things that are really very common areas to be experiencing fears around. They're quite hardwired. If you think about the idea of sort of a fear of being sick, actually, it's really hardwired to us. In many millennia ago, if someone within the tribe was being unwell, actually that reaction to either help them, stay away from them is very understandable. Here we are in 2023, and that really powerful reaction that can bring up for many people is understandable in that context. But it's how can we update and support a child or young person so that it doesn't interfere with their everyday experiences? As I think by the sound of it, there'll be members of the audience who have had this experience. Social anxiety is something that is very commonly experienced. And I think particularly as we go into our age group that we've been talking about today, which is that upper age group, teenage years, social anxiety becomes more and more prolific. But I think also it is the case for those who have sort of primary school age children that actually we're seeing more and more of it sort of emerging in that age group. So social anxiety fears typically focus on a range of social situations, and thoughts will tend to focus on things like, I'm going to embarrass myself. Oh, that person thinks I'm really stupid. They think I'm rubbish at football. They think I won't be any good at helping them in the group task in English. They're going to think I'm rubbish. They're going to think I'm ugly. You know, all these sort of horrible internal thoughts that go through. And I think one of the important things to keep in mind, and again, thinking about some of the causes we talked about earlier, is unfortunately our young people are exposed to all sorts of different messages, including potentially being bullied. And I think then when we're trying to make sense of anxiety, it's really important to make sense about where the anxiety is response to a particular threat and situation, and where it's out of keeping with what's going on. So trying to be that detective, find that balance. And again, something we'll come back to in a wee while. Many of you may have had experience of having young people in your households where there is persistent worry. So a way to think about worry is it's the thinking part of anxiety, and it can tend to be about a range of concerns rather than single issues. And worry can be very catching, by which I mean we meet young children and young people where there's that what if moment. What if this happens? And if that happens, what if that? What if this? What if we have a car accident today? What if in the car accident someone gets hurt? What if that happens? What if someone doesn't see us coming? So again, that kind of persistent sort of pattern of thinking about a range of topics, often interestingly connecting to sort of personal safety and safety of others, and can lead to a number of noticeable impacts, including that fear of separation, actually. Interesting, they can include a bit of a mixture of sort of thoughts that are about the fact that I need to worry, and thoughts that are kind of overwhelming. This is going to get in way of my life. So certainly I met young people who say, actually, if I can't stop this worrying, it's going to drive me crazy. I just can't stop my brain. It keeps on going and going. But can also hold the thought of, but actually I really need to get this right. This science exam is really important, has to be perfect. And if I don't worry, I won't be prepared for it. So this kind of thinking about thinking can often be a really important clue for what's keeping the anxiety going for a young person. So that idea of, on the one hand, I can't stop worrying, I really want to stop, it's driving me crazy. And on the other hand, but actually I've been told I really need to prepare for this, I need to worry, it's the only way I'm going to be successful at this exam. So that kind of ebb and flow can be really hard, but actually when we can spot it, it can often be a good clue of how to help. I'm going to talk a little bit about panic at this point. So panic, again, is a term that comes up in a lot of different conversations that we have with children and young people, both in services such as CAMHS, other support services, but also in our daily lives as well. How often do we hear people say, oh, do you know what? I was in a right panic when I didn't think I was going to get back in time to do the presentation this evening. Not that I'm saying that, but it's certainly, so panic, though, in its very specific form, and this may be something you've witnessed yourself or experienced yourself, as a sudden and really intense experience of physical anxiety. And there are some very specific thoughts focusing on that there's a very high likelihood that something's physically wrong, that can then trigger a cycle of anxiety that gets into a spiral. And what can then happen actually is, often after a single panic attack, which can often feel like it comes out of the blue, one of the worries is that it's going to happen again. I thought, just to help, I'd just map out a little bit of a cycle, just to give us some thoughts about what this might look like. So again, the trigger being, teacher tells class there's a mock GCSE science paper on Friday. I start to get the thoughts of, oh man, that's only 2 days away. I don't even know what photosynthesis is. I don't know how I'm going to do that. I start to feel anxious. My heart starts to beat faster. Hang on a second. Why is my heart beating? I feel really weird. What's happening? I feel really hot. I don't know what's going on. And in thinking that, then my anxiety feelings increase. So I'm even more sort of picking up on what's going on. There's something really wrong. I'm going to fall over. I can't stop this. I got COVID. What's going on? So more anxiety, more physical symptoms increase. And in the end, what happens, we get into that crescendo of panic. What that might then lead to is that, again, that fight or flight, I have to get out of here. And what people might often do is that it's again that hypervigilance to physical symptoms, that kind of being really on the alert. We get programmed to think, oh, that's a real threat, but it's a threat from inside. And panic can be really disabling and impactful on our children and young people. But again, starting to notice where the patterns of thinking, not just what might have triggered it, but what keeps it going, what keeps the cycle in place. If our young people are able to say, actually, when my heart beats fast, I've had young people say, oh, it just feels like I'm going to have a heart attack. And when you explore that a bit further, you find out actually that thought is there. I'm ill, I'm going to have a heart attack. This feels so wrong. And that's where the cycle is something we can, if we're really attending to it, can be a helpful clue again about how we can help. Just touching, I'm really aware that some of the questions that come before the workshop today focused on obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD. And I think, as we said at the beginning, is that in order to do justice to your experience as families and as carers, and some of the topics we're talking about today, really nice to have much more time. So it's possible in the future what we might be thinking about doing is running some broader workshops that perhaps, for example, could focus on OCD and obsessions and compulsions, which is a very complex experience. But just, I suppose, in its briefest possible form, and these may be, again, things you've noticed in your children and young people, is the experience of obsession, so intrusive thoughts, images, feelings, and it's those connected compulsions, so actions that are designed to reduce the anxiety that comes up because of those intrusive thoughts, but also is designed to neutralize or wipe out that feared outcome. I think one of the most important things that we try and do when we're helping young people, when they suddenly get these thoughts that pop in, is just that reminder that intrusive thoughts are very natural. It's something we all experience, but what happens when we find we get stuck in a cycle is those thoughts come again and again and become very vivid and very true, and we start to engage with them and start to worry, gosh, if I don't act on that, if I don't try and stop that, there would be a horrible thing that will happen and I'll be responsible. And that notion of responsibility is really powerful, that sense of, actually, unless I do this, I'm going to cause something awful to happen. So that's incredibly powerful. And for those on the call who've seen this happen, may have had experience themselves, it can be hugely overwhelming. So from a broader point of view, again, when we think about obsessive compulsions, it's that, very commonly it might be a fear of contamination. It might be a fear of harm, so a fear of harm coming to self or to other people. It might be also what's quite common, particularly in those teenage years, thinking about our word bubble earlier on, our word cloud, is it can be that you might get intrusive thoughts of a more sexual nature, for example, and they can feel very overwhelming. And very often what we find is that there's this kind of balance, and what might happen is that there could be an acknowledgement from a young person who might say, well, I kind of know those thoughts aren't rational, I know they're not logical, but I just can't get them out of my head. What then happens is that you think, well, I've got to neutralize these, I've got to get a relief, I've got to get safety through hand washing, through ordering, repeating, checking and counting. One of the questions that has been raised before our workshop today is how might we understand the line between OCD and things like having a fear of germs? And it is a line that can sometimes be quite difficult to make sense of, but the key thing is often where there's a fear of germs, it will be very specific to certain situations. So those kind of very specific triggers around sort of contact with germs, or very specific triggers when it's a sense of needing to wash to specifically get rid of the germs. Where OCD might emerge is more within that bigger picture, where it's more pervasive, so where it occurs even away from a specific trigger, and actually what the routines are designed to do is to avoid in the young person's mind a sort of a wider, more horrible outcome, a risk of much bigger risk of harm or sense of harm to others or self. But I think it is a very complex experience. I'd really encourage those in the call who are supporting children and young people with these kind of very stuck behaviours, very high intensity anxiety, to obviously seek further support. And it may be that actually those are the young people we'd really encourage to come and talk to us and to have some further conversations with us and our teams. Just thinking briefly about the impact of COVID. So, one of the things that unites us in the audience today is that we have all been involved and impacted in COVID in our own personal ways. And I was really conscious earlier on when we were talking about our worries as adults, is that, sadly, there may be a number of us on the call today who, due to COVID, have lost family members, who've experienced health difficulties ourselves. So there's a huge impact that young people also take on in that respect as well. The World Health Organization estimates that the global prevalence of anxiety and depression increased by about 25% following COVID. And it is still, unfortunately, too early to understand the longer impact on social development and anxiety in our children. Many young people report a wide range of responses to the pandemic, including, on the one hand, a significant increase in anxiety, but also experiencing some unexpected positive effects as well. So actually, for many people who found school overwhelming, the sudden ending of school felt like it was a real relief. The challenge you may have found yourself is often when schools reopened again, is actually getting back into school and adjusting to that very different environment. What's interesting is quite a bit of the research suggests at the moment that for those who are most affected by the pandemic, as you might expect, it's where there were pre-existing anxiety difficulties before the pandemic came into interfere with life in such a dramatic way. So that doesn't mean to say, however, if your child or young person was managing very well before COVID, that it shouldn't be that they require, it's very important that extra support is identified if needed, but it's just to keep in mind about the effects of COVID, particularly on worries about family, worries about germs, and sort of wider anxieties relating to that. I'm also really mindful that there may be families on the call today, on the workshop today, who have young people in their households who have autism, ADHD, sort of broader neurodevelopmental differences. And I think one of the key messages that we would give is that, first of all, those young people are more likely to be vulnerable to anxiety difficulties. And although the interaction between thoughts and feelings behaviors is very similar to other children of their age, the influence of specific ways of processing information, including, for example, sensory information, will be even more important to reflect upon. I can't do this too much justice in a short while, and I think I'd really encourage, again, the other workshops in our package today may have some really helpful additional information when thinking about people with autism. But one of the things that might be really important to keep in mind is that when we work with children and young people who have these types of differences, or who process in a very particular way related to their autism, for example, it may be they process at a much more detailed level. So in a situation where a trigger isn't immediately obvious, really looking at the small level of detail in that situation could be even more important for children and young people. And also the recognition that children and young people with autism and broader neurodevelopmental differences can find it more challenging to detect internal change quickly, and may experience sudden increases in anxiety that can suddenly sort of feel like they emerge from nowhere. One of the, I've seen somewhere a young person was interviewed, and they talked about, for them, what they experienced was consistent inconsistency. So they were a young person who really craved that predictability, but also found their life that the thing that they could predict was actually life is unpredictable. And that was something that with support, they managed to find a way of managing in a way that worked for them. But if we think about that, think about those experiences, it's no surprise that our young people with these experiences might tend to be more vulnerable to anxiety in the longer term. So it's something really, as we do already, to keep an eye on. So what can we do to help as parents and carers? So just dividing this section into a couple of different areas. So thinking a bit about how we might talk about anxiety, thinking about first aid, thinking about reassurance and structure, and then thinking about how we might address avoidance. And again, on the call today, there's likely to be quite a volume of people who have strategies you use already. So this may give some ideas of things that you can add, but I'm also really conscious that hopefully there might be some new ideas that we touch on as well. So I think one of the sort of great benefits at the moment of the kind of animation boom is that there's some really sophisticated cartoons out there that have some great metaphors for thinking around anxiety. So many of you might recognize the characters from Inside Out. And I think that's a great way if we're thinking about how we can start to help young people, not just at our youngest end of our spectrum today, but thinking right at the older end, just thinking about metaphor, thinking about something that a young person can connect with as a starting point. I think Inside Out is something that comes up an awful lot for children that I meet, in that sense of, oh, it's kind of like I've got these different types of feelings. There's a whole range of them, but sometimes one takes control and then the other one needs to take over. So, it's really a good starting point when there's something already out there in popular culture. But communication is key, and I think it's an awareness of the unique ways in which our children communicate difficult feelings with us is incredibly important. I think, again, coming back to the comment one of the audience made earlier, I think it is really important to get that balance, but the first step is generally to sort of normalize anxiety, name it, and recognize what's happening. When we're anxious, our ability to communicate can reduce dramatically, so it can be helpful to use the tools we have available. I don't know, in speaking to the audience this evening, you may well find in your house that even if you're sitting on the same sofa as the child you're caring for, their main way of communicating could still be well be WhatsApp. And I think one of the phenomenon that came out of COVID was that the connections that young people make with each other, again, are much more online. You know, they were before, but COVID amplified that. So Discord, WhatsApp, other types of instant messaging, you know, these are the ways that young people tend to communicate. So why not use that to our advantage? So using emojis, using code words. So what you could do is come up with a word that, you know, that your child would text you when they felt anxiety was increasing, but felt embarrassed to talk about it or didn't quite know how to put it into words. It's about having an agreed plan. That code word could trigger that. Flashcards can also be very helpful as well in terms of a visual way of just letting you know that something's building and that it gives you an earlier opportunity to put something into action. I think it can't be underestimated as well that even if you've got older children in your household, again, we're talking late teenagers, getting ideas onto paper can be incredibly powerful. So that idea of externalizing, taking an image, you know, what does anxiety look like for you? Because it sounds like there's lots going on. I've certainly met young people, 17, 18-year-olds, who, although they might give a bit of a sigh when I say, could we get it down on paper, actually find drawing anxiety, drawing what it feels like to them, could be incredibly helpful in feeling like they've got something to handle, they've got something they can work with. And it could be that it's you know, I've seen young people who will have very ornate, very detailed pictures, other young people where it's actually much more of a whole mass of different types of colors. But again, it's very individual to them and it gives something to focus on and concentrate on. When we say first aid, I think it's not to diminish how useful these strategies can be, but to perhaps see them as being some first line ideas, some first steps that you might take. I think I'm really aware as a parent myself and thinking when I'm trying to help my son when his anxiety is high, when you're out somewhere, when you're a shopping centre, in a cinema, when you're at a friend's house, sometimes, you know, the first step is to try and bring down that initial high level of anxiety, that heightened feeling that's there, in order then to think about some longer term strategies. So again, when we think about first aid, it's about that first step. So distraction can be helpful in the short term, and I think it can be a bit more counterproductive as a long-term strategy. So what we want to do is to have something that's going to help in the first instance while we think of the next steps to make sense of the anxiety, potential triggers, and other longer-term strategies to help make changes and manage those feelings more effectively in the future. But it could involve things that you do already, so fidget toys, sensory items. I'm really aware there may be families on the call today, on the workshop today, who have young people in your households who have certain sensory aversiveness, who are very sensitive to certain sensory stimulation. But actually, one of the things to keep in mind is that it could also be the case that that could be a path to harness things that are more calming for that young person. And that goes for any level of ability in terms of our young people. So actually, when we lose our ability to communicate verbally, having ways of connecting using smell, using sound, using non-verbal types of cues can be incredibly important. Another thing I think to keep in mind, and this reflects back to our word cloud earlier, is that it's about how we might understand our child's values. So if we can understand, you know, what makes, you know, I think we all probably would say, well, you know, my son or daughter or the person I care for, this is how I describe them. But understanding what's behind some of the behavior in some of their choices can then help us manage when anxiety is high. So values are really like the lighthouse that guides us through the storm. It's the thing that connects to our choices. So what it might be, for example, I've certainly met young people who say, well, actually, one of my values is really important for me to help other people. And what's then happened when their anxiety has been high is that, quite to their surprise, you know, there's been ways of activating that value for them, and it's meant that they've been able to find themselves coming down from that heightened state. You may have found examples like that yourself. Great activities and that kind of sense of producing something, the sense of connecting with that creativity can be really important. You know, create an emergency playlist that only gets used when anxiety is high. That connection of songs that are meaningful. It doesn't have to necessarily be relaxing music. I know a lot of young people might find it's quite the opposite that helps to bring them down. But again, what that young person values. Just as a quick example, we can use things like conversation cards in that, when we're exploring that, so, for them, what does independence mean to you? What makes you strong? Who do you admire? Who do you think's wise? Those can give us little clues about how our young people's values kind of fit together. And then when anxiety is present, we can try and see whether we can get behind that anxiety and introduce something that's going to connect to a bit more to who they are. Again, we'll come back to that a little bit later on. So in terms of other aspects of first aid, many of you might use relaxation approaches, but also I think more broadly, it can be really helpful to introduce grounding ideas, the things that are helping us to connect away from the anxiety into the moment. So people may have come across the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 exercise, asking them to think about what 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, 1 thing you can taste. Again, that sense of bringing them much more into the moment, focusing away from the anxiety. I think it's also helpful to mention the idea of diffusion. So what diffusion does is it's learning to treat our thoughts as thinking and labeling them as such. So a starting point might be is to help a child write down what their thoughts are. What that does, of course, it gives us the clues to what they're worrying about, but actually taking it outside of the brain, taking it outside of that worry that's going on and putting it down on page can be a great way of thinking, actually, these are thoughts. They're not all of me. These are things that are going around my head, but they don't have to define me. So that diffusion. There's a video I put the link for there, and what I'll do is that when that gets the slides get sent out, might be really interesting for people to have a look at that and see what you think. But again, it's that principle of these are thoughts, they don't have to be all of you. One of the things that's also, I think, really helpful when we're in this sort of situation is, again, how can we bring that together in a way that feels most accessible for the young person? Again, what's a kind of way of giving a map for how we do this? One of the approaches I really like is the metaphor of dropping the anchor. And it's that idea, it's linked to acceptance and commitment therapy. It's that idea that helps support that, in a storm, in that anxiety storm, we can't necessarily prevent that storm, but what we can do is find stability in the middle of one and try and anchor ourselves throughout. So what we're trying to do is trying to help our children acknowledge their thoughts and feelings, helping them come back into their bodies to connect with what's going on around them, away from the anxiety, and engage in what they're doing, that refocus. And I think for people who have met me at work, they're sort of really aware that one of my other sides is a big science fiction fan. It's the other metaphor I like to use. It's a bit like a black hole. If you see those movies where the ship's trying to escape from the black hole and they're just on the edge, you feel like getting pulled in. You've got that gravity, and that's where anxiety can feel like. Anxiety feels like it's a black hole, it's pulling you in. So if what you can do is anchor yourself, you're still aware that the black hole's there, but you're stable and safe, and you can then start to observe what's going on. One way of looking at this is actually to have a script, almost something that you bring into action in these kind of moments. And I wonder whether, if you'd feel happy to, and you'd like to join, I'm just going to read through perhaps an example of that now. This is from Russ Harris. And I'm just going to read through as it's in the slides. So again, you might want to look at this another time when the slides come out. But again, if you just make yourself as comfortable as possible where you are at the moment and see how you might feel about this. So what you might say to the child person, you might say, well, it looks like you're experiencing a lot of really strong emotions at the moment. I really want to try and help you handle it. And I can see you're struggling with them. I'd like to try and help. See if you can listen to my instructions. So first of all, push your feet hard into the floor. Sit forward in your chair and straighten your back. Try and press your fingertips together and move your elbows and your shoulders and feel your arms moving all the way from your fingers to shoulder blades. So notice there's a lot of emotions here that you're struggling with, but there's also a body around those emotions, a body that you can move and control. So if you just notice your body now, hands, feet, back, have a stretch, keep pressing your feet down into the floor. So now also look around the room. See if you can notice 5 things that you can see around you. Maybe also try and notice 3 or 4 things you can hear. But also notice you and me working here together as a team. So you'll notice there's something difficult here that you're struggling with, but also notice your body in the chair. Move it, stretch it, take control of your arms and legs. and also notice the room around you. And there's you and I here working together as a team. So that's just a brief example. And I think it comes back again to that idea that, well, anxiety is a very natural response to things. What we're trying to do is achieve a balance so that actually the anxiety doesn't become overwhelming. And exercises like this can, again, help to prompt that idea. So staying in the moment, being aware that the anxiety is there, but not trying to push it away. And I realize that actually, if we think about our experience as parents and carers, that can be easier said than done. And it will often be a combination of things that help and work. But one metaphor that's quite helpful, I think, is that idea that when you've got an anxious thought or feeling and you try and push it away, it's a bit like a beach ball that you're pushing into a swimming pool. You can keep it down the surface for quite a wee while, but after a while, you're going to let go of it and it's going to pop up to the surface again. So I think having that way that we can sit with that, that metaphor again, is more like the beach ball is floating down the end of the pool. It's there, but you can keep some distance from it. So again, these types of strategies can be really helpful in those circumstances. We talked a bit about communication earlier as well. And one of the things I think is really helpful is about how we structure our communication. So people may be familiar already with this, which is the incredible 5-point scale. And people may also have experiences of being asked to rate anxiety, or asking our children, where do you feel you're at on a scale of 1 to 10? Often by a psychologist, possibly, because we seem to love scaling questions. This is a little bit different though, because I think our function in terms of helping our children is to help them make sense of that internal experience as best as possible, but to help them feel it's unique to them. Because actually, again, our experience of anxiety, they're going to be informed by so many different things. I think it's important that young people feel that we've got, as it were, we've got their number. We know what's happening for them. So in this example, this is an example from the book where this comes from. This is the My Scared, Afraid, Trembling scale. As you can see, it starts off at the bottom, normal. You can't tell by looking, but I'm feeling anxious. I don't know really would be how it feels like inside. Step 2 would be, well, I still look normal, but my stomach gets queasy. Step 3, you can't tell I'm scared, but my jaw's clenched. And as a parent or carer, you might say, excuse me, that's really interesting. David, when I see you clench your jaw, I also see you drumming your thighs with your hands. Do you think you notice that too? And David might say, well, yeah, actually, I think I do. So you might add that in. So as you can see, it goes up the scale, but it's that important connection between what it looks like and sounds like from the outside, what it feels like on the inside, and making that really personal to your child. We'll come on to that final column in a moment, actually, and we'll just come back to it. So we're going to talk a little bit now about reassurance. So reassurance is quite a tricky topic that as parents and carers we can often find a bit of a struggle to get a balance with. So I think it's really natural as parents and carers that we offer reassurance to our children. It's incredibly important that we do. However, I think one of the things that can be a challenge is that the reassurance we provide can sometimes, if it's not balanced, unintentionally increase anxiety. So thinking about the audience here today, you may well have had experience of giving reassurance to your children, and you say, well, actually, let's say that we go back to my example from earlier. I might go to my parent or carer and say, oh, you know what, it's going to be all right, isn't it? I'm going to get through that science exam. And my carer might say, oh no, yeah, absolutely, you'll be brilliant, you'll be fine. So I wander off, come back 5 minutes later. Are you sure? Because I'm really worried about it. It's going to go really wrong. No, it'll be fine. You'll be great. After a while, you might find over the course of an hour that you've had to answer the same question multiple times. And it can work for a little while, but what you might find is it becomes a pattern. It becomes a bit of a bottomless pit that's quite hard to fill up, and the needs and the questions that may come get bigger and bigger. So it can be very helpful. It's really important we give that safety and reassurance. But what we're trying to do is to think about how we can help a young person reassure themselves, help them see that they've got some of those skills there as well. I think one of the things that, again, thinking back to the question that someone put in the QA earlier, is it's that situation where we're thinking, well, hang on a second, is there a chance I might be accidentally giving the message that this is really something to worry about? We may have all had that experience where we ask someone a question, they go, oh, thanks, I hadn't even thought of that. But it is a fine balance. So I think it's about getting that shared understanding of what the young person's worried about and agreeing on communication and what the reassurance might look like in a way that is going to help that child start to feel that confidence themselves. So in terms of how we might do that, I think, again, it comes back to structure. So what we might think about is it doesn't mean not responding to distress and need, but what it might be is about thinking down with our children and thinking, okay, so let's come up with a plan that we might sign up to, follow through on that plan and be consistent and have praise there as well. So what it might be, for example, is thinking if you get that question, here I am again talking about the science exam on Friday, it might be my parent carer says, first of all, yeah, you'll be great. You've done all your work. You'll be fine. Be really good at this. And I might go and ask them again. They might say, remember what we said last time? What do you think is likely to happen because of what we talked about? And I might go back again. And so if you see what I mean, we're just altering what we're saying, kind of putting it back to me, not with a sense of that I have all the answers, but just very gently helping me connect with the conversations I've had with my carer before. It can take a little while. It can be about fine-tuning the reassurance we give. But I think it, again, steps that balance. You're acknowledging that someone's upset. You're acknowledging that anxiety, but you're also helping them in a way that gives them that sense of control. Later on, one of the things that we'll come back to is that there are some really helpful apps that have prompt some of these thinking exercises. So what you might find yourself doing is using one of those apps as a bit of a starting point. And if you're starting to try and help with that independence for your child in terms of their reassurance, it might be that you use an app together, and actually that becomes their way of reassuring themselves as a step towards then letting go of the app and reassuring themselves just because of their own confidence and their ability to manage their anxiety. There is a link on this page that will come out with the slides of a particularly good sort of way of capturing that reassurance process. Okay, so just thinking a little bit more then about that reassurance and structures. So what's very challenging is when the unpredictability can be even more challenging. So what particularly be the case if our children are already quite vulnerable to anxiety about changes in routine. And that can go for anybody in the audience today, but might particularly be the case for young people who have autism, young people with ADHD. So that sense of that vulnerability to change, that heightened anxiety. In situations of high anxiety, what can happen is that we both end up in a situation where we might find that we're improvising and reacting without thinking. We're going to react on instinct, and that's understandable. But sometimes what that can do is unintentionally add to anxiety. So what that can do is add to situations where we're thinking, well, I don't know what to do next. So what we might do sometimes is think about ways we can help our children to accept there's going to be some uncertainty in a situation. And again, one of the ways to do that is to actually think about an agreed plan. So I'm just going to go back to our scale from earlier and just concentrate a little bit more on that far right-hand part of it. So it's about thinking, how do I communicate how I'm feeling, but also what can we agree in advance that we'll do? So in David's case, you'll see up at the side there that it might be about that he would talk to someone he trusts. At the top there, he would ask an adult to help him leave. But again, it's that agreement beforehand about what's going to happen, having that structure so it doesn't come as a surprise. It's a prepared way of responding when our children feel heightened. So again, it's that structure and predictability that can be a great way of starting to scale down that heightened feeling in the first instance. Okay, so just in the last sort of area we're thinking about before we take a short break and come back to thinking about some of the questions that had come in, it's maybe thinking about avoidance and increasing the helpful learning that we can support our children to do. So avoidance is a very natural side effect of anxiety. If something scares us, we are going to want to steer clear of it. So what we can do is we can be really helpful to take our thoughts to court and plan experiments we can do together, not just to, in our sense, to help, to show that things are going to be okay, but to enhance that new learning, enhance that information that they have and what could happen next time. One of the ways I like to think about it is it's almost in a way, and if you excuse me, seeing a picture of a river for some reason I could find, which is the Mississippi. So if we think of our usual way of responding to anxiety as being like a river that's flowing in one direction all the time. So to begin with, that river flowed that way because that's what worked. That's what helped. The anxiety is flowing in one direction. However, over time, it's becoming unhelpful. That avoidance, the not being able to manage things is getting in the way of our children's ability to do what they want to do. So what new information can do, and exploring and finding out about the anxiety, is to carve a more helpful and deeper stream for that anxiety to go down. So eventually what happens is the water goes down that new pattern rather than getting stuck in that old way. How do we do that? Well, actually, there's ways of that, thinking about how we can do gradual exposure to situations that can help both that habituation. So what we mean to say is that kind of automatic physical reaction, but perhaps more importantly, it helps with new information to respond to that worry. So it's the new stream. It's the way of thinking, actually, maybe I didn't need to be so worried about that test, not just because I've now done the test, but because there's other information I found out, other experiences I've built as I've worked towards that mock paper. In terms of how we might do that with our children, again, it's that gathering of new information in a step-by-step approach. And many of you may use this already. It's that idea of that ladder of success that we're trying to build. It can be really useful when we're doing this as we look at each step, is we're trying to test the prediction that our children are making, thinking, okay, so let's kind of be detectives here. Let's be scientists and figure this out, actually. So your prediction is that this is going to happen. You know, what could we do together that might give us some new information about that prediction? It can be really helpful to build rewards in each step, but also be mindful of where there are safety behaviors, little things our children might be doing that actually stop the lesson being most helpful. And so examples that could be, if we're thinking about panic, for example, earlier, young people might say, well, actually, my anxiety was better because I was, I stopped the physical feelings by chewing gum. And that might have been their initial distraction. But what that doesn't do is give new information about the thoughts and feelings they were having, that new information is that threat, that feeling that their physical feelings are going to overwhelm them wasn't as much of a threat as they might think. So it's really careful to think, actually, how do we put this lesson together we're trying to teach in a way that's going to give us that new and helpful information. So just as an example, here's a ladder of success for a young person. This is adapted from a book that's referenced at the end from Kathy Cresswell and Lucy Willits, Helping Your Child with Fears and Worries, that many people may have come across. So again, we're trying to test predictions. In this instance, we've got Lucy, and what Lucy was doing was that she was really worried about asking a question in class. So her ultimate goal is to ask the teacher a question in front of the whole class, and the ultimate reward was a trip to Thorpe Park. Sometimes we have to be careful about the rewards that we give, because sometimes we can accidentally commit ourselves to something that's difficult to follow through on, like a PlayStation 5, for example. At the bottom, we've got, well, ask the teacher a question after the class has gone and there's no one else there. So the prediction being, well, my teacher will be cross with me for asking something after class. So you might need to have some help with this. You might need to bring the teacher on board with this, but the aim would be, well, let's find out, Lucy, what might it be like? What will you notice? How will you feel? What actually happens? So testing that prediction step by small step as needed. The sort of predictions you might be testing would be, well, people will laugh at me, I'll get into trouble. I noticed earlier that we were talking a little bit about those kind of worries about, well, I'm going to feel overwhelmed. These feelings won't stop unless I do the thing that helps my anxiety go down. That's the only thing that's going to help me. I need to leave the classroom. So again, we're gently testing those predictions. Finally, before we take a short break, I think there's a message I think is most important and sometimes gets missed, which is about the looking after ourselves as parents and carers. Anxiety is very powerful, and it can have a huge effect on our children and a huge effect on us as a consequence. So I think actually one of the things to keep in mind, there's no one size fits all rule book to being a carer and helping when our children are anxious. I think it's very important to feel it's okay that we will make mistakes, and it's important to be kind and compassionate to ourselves as we would be trying to be with the children we care for. So, we're trying to model for them to be kind to themselves. I think it's really important that we're kind to ourselves too. We talked about values earlier, and I think it's helpful to kind of revisit and think about what we value as well. So, it's very likely that on the call today that you've come along because you value your role as being a carer and you want to help the children in your lives. But it's also about thinking, so what makes me away from being a carer? No matter how big or small, helping to connect with what makes you your individual selves as well when life becomes stressful and overwhelming. A standing joke in my office is that, slightly surprisingly given my appearance, is that I'm an enormous fan of metal music. And for me, and people laugh at me and say, what's with music with all the shouty shouts? What on earth are you doing? for me, listening to music, connecting with music is a really important reminder that, I am absolutely a parent and a carer, but also there's a part of me, and particularly given how my son reacts to my musical taste, that's very separate from my son's life. And I think that's really important in however small a way that we do have a chance to connect to that as well. Lastly, I think it's spotting what things may trigger our own anxieties and looking for opportunities to come back together and alongside our children to share strategies. So I think, for example, I've met with families before where a child's had to travel somewhere, or they've had to have a medical procedure like an injection. More recently, when they might say, well, actually, I find that really difficult too. Maybe it's something I need to help myself. I've even had parents who have had injections themselves to model for their children. That's not saying you all have to go out there and have an injection, but it is just that idea. It might be some things to model and come alongside our children to help them. Okay. So you'll see from the slides when they come out, I've included some general references. One of the things I would just draw your attention to is that, so the books I mentioned there, they are pretty much available, lots of availability in secondhand. One of the things I would mention though is that there's some good free apps from Google Play and the App Store that you might well be really interested in as well. So there's quite a lot of options and possibilities out there. What I'm going to suggest, so it's just gone 8:15. I'm going to suggest we take a 5-minute break or so. And then we'll come back and we'll spend sort of 15 minutes or so just seeing if we can touch on some of the questions that came in prior to the workshop. So I'm going to turn my video off just for a moment. If you stay logged in to the seminar, and then I will turn my camera back on in about 5 minutes time. And then again, we'll try and look at some of the questions that have come in. So I look forward to seeing you in 5 minutes time or so. So welcome back, everybody. Just I was aware that Bobby, you'd asked in the chat to put the list of books back up. I will stop the screen share for a moment, but just the slides will be sent out, so there will be an opportunity to get that book list. Carly, thank you. I know in the chat you've also mentioned, and the QA you've asked a couple of different titles that you've come across as well. So for those who haven't seen the Q&A, Carly, you mentioned about the Starving the Anxiety Gremlin as being a good book, and Think Good, Feel Good. I think one of the interesting things is that there's now a huge range of huge range of books available out there. And I think it's often about finding a good starting point. So as you were saying there, Carly, Think Good, Feel Good is one of those that could be a good starting point. The Helping Your Child with Worry and Anxiety book that's on the reading list here is also a really good, I suppose the right word would be primer. So if I just grab it, I've got my copy here. So it's a book that not only talks about some of the issues we've talked about today, but it has separate chapters around, for example, generalized worries and anxieties, anxiety about eating, anxieties about health, worries and panic, helping your child when something bad happens. So I'm really mindful in our work, in our conversations today with the word cloud. People mentioned a bit about where there's been loss, for example, as well. So in the last sort of 10 or 15 minutes or so, I'll try my best to, there was some questions that had come through before our presentation today. One of the things, there was a couple of questions that had come through was in relation to emetophobia. And I think it's something that is a really, can be a really confusing and scary situation. So for those who aren't familiar with the term, emetophobia is about, and just a bit of warning for those who might find this uncomfortable, is about a fear of being sick. And I think very often it can generalize as well. So that fear of being sick goes beyond the sense of fear that I'm going to be sick, but it can become very generalized in terms of making that young person worry that they will come across sick, so that someone in the class is going to be sick. So you may find that your child will come home from school and say, I'm not going to school tomorrow. And when you try and find out why, it's because someone has been ill, not even necessarily has been sick, but they've been ill, and that worry thought of, oh my goodness, what if they're sick next to me? As we were saying earlier, I think one of the challenging aspects of emetophobia, or fear of being sick, is it also connects to some of those primal sort of fears that we might have. And it has some connections when we sort of think about fear of things like fear of blood, that sense of, this is something that we're quite programmed to react to. The good news is that there are quite a range of supports available when we think about emetophobia, that fear of being sick. And actually, in terms of resources, and what I'll perhaps try and do, because a number of people have asked about it, is try and put some of the resources on the list we send out, is that gradual exposure approach is still by far the most effective approach. It just means in terms of, sort of creativity that we might need to use in helping with that gradual exposure, is it might be thinking about how we can take step by step. So for example, certainly when I work with young people with emetophobia, what's happened is it started off with sort of even just the word sick can be a starting point, and feeling that actually there's a prediction a young person might have as well. Oh goodness, even if I hear that, I'm going to be sick myself, you know. And actually, if we immediately went into, right, you have to see a video, so I'm being sick, it's very likely that might trigger a reaction. But again, it's the gentlest of possible starts. And what we're trying to do again is to carve that new path, that sense of actually, maybe I can cope with this better than I thought I could. Maybe there's something I hadn't understood about anxiety that will, you know, help me to find a way of reacting differently. So what I'll do though is, because a couple of people have asked that question, I'll look at adding a resource around that in particular into the slides that go out. One of the questions that had come through was thinking a bit more broadly about the interaction between anxiety and gender identity. And I think it's something that's very profound at the moment in terms of, sort of raising awareness of the different ways in which we might understand ourselves, our own sense of identity, the identity we want to portray to other people. And I think whilst it is the case that you know, we may encounter young people who have a sense of distress and anxiety about their identity, there are many young people who actually feel very sort of proud and connected to that identity. So, you know, the question that had come in was about, is there something of a sort of a direct connection, particularly for young people who may identify as a different gender to that was given at birth, and that it's also that they're an autistic young person as well. I think the answer is, again, it's very much more of a sort of a nuanced approach that we might take. So it's about understanding in terms of that sense of where that gender identity or that identity of self comes in, what the values that young persons have, how do they conceptualize how they see themselves. But I think particularly it's that reactivity, and we talked about social anxiety earlier. Very often it's less about the sense of I'm not sure who I am, and more about I know who I am. It's the reaction of other people. And I think very sadly, we've had experiences of young people who have experienced significant bullying. Having said that, there is also a broader community and a broader acceptance of gender identity and other senses or ways of identifying that would also be helpful to connect with. So just to perhaps give an example of how that might be impactful, a colleague of mine was working with a young person a number of years or so ago. One of their sort of experiences was working with young people who had found and felt like they were very much on the outside of a group, because they were in a school community where it felt no one identified in the same way as they did. As part of a homework task in between sessions, what they found themselves doing was setting a task for that person to perhaps go away and do some research and get a sense of how many young people shared that characteristic outside, you know, in a global scale. What they found was the young person came back and said, well, you know, it doesn't immediately stop me worrying about the reaction in my individual class, but I found out that this many people across the globe feel the same way as me, and they can connect this idea. And I think just kind of broadening that horizon, as we might say, kind of broadening bandwidth, getting a sense about where there are more connections to be made away from that immediate, in the moment experience. And again, that's not dismissing the fact that young people unfortunately can experience significant discrimination, elements of their identity, elements of their culture. And I think it's very important we attend to that, but also one way is about helping again for them to feel proud and connect to their identity, because it's something that they can see as being part of a bigger picture. One of the things that other people had asked earlier in the chat was thinking a little bit, and I think this perhaps brings us to that question around sort of that fear of contamination. So one of the things that I think has come up as a lot of questions is that sort of sense to which young people are engaging much more in that sort of awareness of germs and that awareness of where contamination might come across. So one of the questions that came through is about how might we address behaviours that started during COVID, where you know, the hand washing was something. If you think about the messages we had as adults, and we were then asked to have to put across to our children, you know, it's the, you know, sing happy birthday, it's the idea of what we have to do in order to stay safe. We went from being a culture that hopefully had good hand hygiene to being a culture that would say, actually, you need to wash your hands at every opportunity. Or that perhaps, we may have had situations where, the guidance might have been, well, you need to make sure the food that you're bringing into the house is clean. Certainly in my house, in my family, there were members of my family who felt so concerned that they were sort of wiping down food that had come through from, the bought in the shops. And I think that was a very common experience. So the question that had been put was, well, how do we reset that? We're in an era still where there's lots of concerns about where contamination could be there, that the message is still out there. And I think it's that approach again of resetting expectations. So one of the things might be is about coming up with a contract. So thinking, okay, so if you're feeling as though you need to wash your hands all the time, and it's specifically because of germs in your hands, or that it might be COVID, it might be thinking, okay, so what might be the case? Let's think about the times that commonly people wash their hands now. So bringing it up to the here and now. So you might agree, okay, well, it's after going to the loo, before and after eating, after sneezing, coughing, or blowing your nose, when you get home, and when there is something on your hands, something visible on your hands. Where there might need to be some support is that, if you've got a young person in the house who's continually washing their hands, because of that fear of, I've got COVID on my hands, I've got germs. And that's not to diminish, as we said earlier, where there might be a more marked OCD type of presentation, thinking, well, actually, I'm going to cause harm to other people, I'm going to cause harm to myself. But more specifically, this is about where there's that fear of germs. Oh, I've got germs on my hands. It's about helping them deal with the uncertainty there. So again, if we thought about that ladder to success earlier, what you might be thinking about doing is, okay, so can we work towards you washing your hands at certain times only? And what might we need to do to make that okay? And some of that might be about being able to support them to be okay with the fact they're going to have to make a change and not wash their hands at other times. So that sense of saying, okay, you know, naming it, I think you're going to feel anxious when we stop doing this in the first instance, but that's okay. We can be there together. We're going to have some ways of helping with that. And actually then we say, well, what did you notice? Well, I did stop washing my hands and I was super anxious about it, but because we did it, in a very small way to start with, again, that's a bit of a generalization, but again, it's the smallest steps possible. And what we're trying to do is help learn that new information. You will find if there's that real pressure, again, we all experience this during COVID, we were suddenly washing our hands to the nth degree, more so than we ever had done before. And whilst it's a bit of an overshare, I still find myself going into when we've been out in toilet somewhere, and inevitably there's someone who walks out of toilets without washing their hand at all, which first and foremost is unpleasant. But you think, gosh, if you think about it, we were that far ago and we were, sort of thinking so much about washing hands. We've reverted back to what probably, unfortunately, is a bit of normality. But again, it's those small steps. It's about helping to reset what's in the here and now and building that new information. And that new information is, first of all, what the harm is genuinely there, but also about the new information about what our children can manage when they don't think they're able to. But because we're doing it in really small steps, what we're doing is we're not overwhelming them. We're not introducing new and distressing situations that are going to add to the anxiety that's already there. There's going to be a little bit of anxiety that builds as we go up each step. But again, what we're doing is we're trying to do that in such small ways that it gives that little bit of a challenge, that new information, and then we go up a step and up a step and up a step, that slow progress. Okay, so it just seemed just in the last few moments, again, someone had mentioned in the in the chat a little bit more about their experiences. So I think one of the things that can be difficult, and it's not perhaps the best forum to talk about it, because I'm aware that being able to do it live would be something a little bit easier, but that sense of I'd be curious about again the particular thoughts. So you mentioned that your child hates it, and it'd be really helpful perhaps to explore gently with them, and also knowing at the age the young person is that it's a very intimate thing, isn't it, that's involved in. But it's about being curious in a very non-judgmental way, as I'm sure you're being, about, so what's the hate about? So it feels like from what you've added, there is that sort of anxiety of washing and showering as well. and whether there's that connection. You know, and unfortunately, human beings are you know, by our very nature, we produce things that are unpleasant. It's part of being sort of part of you know, that being part of being a human being. So I think it is not uncommon that we find, particularly during puberty, that children can become much more bodily aware. It's like, oh, you know, I'm changing, this is disgusting. I'm a bit mindful from what you said, there's also an anxiety for them about washing or showering. And I think it would be really helpful to understand again a bit more, is there a sensory element involved in that? Is there an element to which it's again that worry of, well, actually, you know, showering or washing won't get rid of these feelings for me. And they, you know, it'd be really interesting just to again sort of map a little bit, get it out of their head and onto the page. You know, what's this about? I think from what you described, you know, it could be possible that anxiety of washing or showering is something connected, but equally it might be that sense of, I've certainly met children where it's, well, even if I wash or shower, these things aren't going to go away. I'm still going to get overwhelmed by it. So I think probably the first point is about that detective work, getting it out of their head onto the page in a gentle way, trying to understand, so what is it that the hate is about? And I think that's a good starting point. What I'd also encourage, though, if it's something that potentially, particularly given their age as well, and we talked earlier about, you know, one of our concerns is when we have something that's interfering hugely for a child or young person, but also if we think about in the context of their peers as well, I think it would be really helpful to think, actually, is this something that might need some more targeted support? And I think one of the things, I don't know which area you're in, the person who posted the question 832, but I'd perhaps encourage you to touch base with sort of local services. So if you're in East Sussex, West Sussex, there are single point of access teams there. It might be helpful to talk through in a bit more detail about what they're experiencing. And in Brighton, it's the Wellbeing Service. So it sounds like you've already been really thoughtful about it. But again, I think the first step is trying to understand about the again, that initial side of things. I'm really sorry, just because I'm aware of time this evening. So one of the things I would just suggest, and I think perhaps some of the things that are have been asked about, there's a bit of a link together. So I'm really conscious that the person who asked about health anxiety, Emily, you talked about separation anxiety there as well. And Gemma, you mentioned about the things that are out of control. And I think at the moment, as we talked about earlier, and as Kate mentioned in her introduction, there are all sorts of messages that our children come across at the moment that feel it's so beyond comprehension. You know, the war in Ukraine, all sorts of things are there, the climate change aspect of things. So I think in relation to when things feel out of control, and particularly with that health anxiety, I think again there are sort of broader steps that can be helpful. And some of the resources that I mentioned earlier have some very specific recommendations around health anxiety, for example, or broader anxiety. But I think it's about coming back to what's in the moment. So I think, Gemma, it sounds like you probably had some conversations with the child in your life about, again, how broad those worries are. So it's about maybe thinking, okay, so what can we control in the moment? What are the things within our current sphere? You know, what are the things that we can influence? And it's maybe about thinking again around their values. It sounds possibly as though the child in your life, you know, that sense of wanting to make a change, wanting to think, actually, I need to feel like I'm in control of things, and these things, you know, which is very natural. We all want to feel in control, but these are at the moment things we can't predict. So concentrating on what is predictable and the structure of their days is a good starting point. I think with relation, Emily, to separation anxiety, I think one of the things that often can impact greatly is at night time. And what can happen particularly is that sense of that worry, and that sense of, well, I need you near me, mummy, or you know, I need you there, or so I need to know what you're doing. And possibly others may relate to this as well. There's kind of questions, that reassurance. So one of the things might be is thinking about when your son hates being away from you, what is it they're asking you to do? So are they asking you to be physically close to them? Are they calling out for you? So again, that bit of detective work in the beginning, because with the separation anxiety, there's something about that sort of reassurance of your presence. So it might be, again, in a way that's suitable for someone of 6 years of age, kind of first of all getting it down on paper. You know, what are the things that happen when you worry about being away from mummy, or when you worry about being away from us? Trying to, in again, that appropriate language. I think also you may find that that you notice certain patterns. So what might be helpful is almost, you play that kind of detective in the first instance. What tend to be the situations where the anxiety is at its very highest? What tend to be the situations that it's at medium level, and what situations can surprise you when it's not there at all? So almost keeping a bit of a log of what the pattern is. So we said earlier about how sometimes it can be helpful to disconnect ourselves, to diffuse ourselves from those thoughts that are going round. Equally, as parents, it can be helpful to diffuse ourselves from our immediate reaction, which is that upset we understandably feel when our child is distressed or anxious, and see about, okay, let's play the detective here a little bit. Are there things that might surprise me? Because at the moment, obviously you were saying there, it affects you greatly, but actually having that opportunity to take a step away from it, almost seeing it as, we talked about new information earlier, seeing it as a bit of a task across the week to record some new information, think, okay, that's really interesting. So are there more patterns here than I might think? Again, separation anxiety is also something that's very common for a young person of his age. But as you said yourself, that doesn't stop it affecting you hugely. So I think, again, the key things are there some ways that you might be able to get those thoughts and feelings organized a little bit in a way that you can both see? So again, it could be a picture, you could be the scribe or the drawer, make it sort of a very gentle process. You might find, again, there are certain patterns to that anxiety that are more prominent. So you might notice, well, it's particularly at going to school time, night time, particularly if I have to go out somewhere, and it might be then trying to break that down into those, again, those small steps. So what's going to help us get to the goal of you feeling okay if mummy has to go out? What are the things that might start to build us towards that? So again, some of the resources I mentioned earlier on would also perhaps connect with that as well. And I should just say, with apologies to everybody who would also ask questions, is that I'm not on commission, but again, this is a really good starting point as a book. It's fairly inexpensive, but it certainly has chapters on a number of different areas, including Emily on separation anxiety, and Gemma, I think, as well, in that kind of wider sense of what happens when our children worry about bad things that might happen. I'm really sorry, because I'm aware that there are other questions in the chat, and with apologies to those we didn't manage to get to. We are going to have to finish there for our event this evening. So can I just extend a huge thanks to you all for joining this evening and for your participation. It's been a real privilege to have a chance to share some information with you. What we hope to do, as Melissa mentioned in her video earlier, is to have more opportunities in the future. And I think your feedback today being incredibly important, but also thinking back to some of the questions you've raised. I think we've already got some ideas, particularly about whether we might run some workshops in specific areas of anxiety to give us that bit more of that time to focus on things. So again, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate your presence this evening. And it may be that I have a chance to speak to you again at a later stage in the future. So thank you so much.